Recently, it's been reported that Microsoft is potentially going multi-platform, and this is honestly scary news for industry as a whole. Don't get me wrong, Xbox going multi-plat is definitely their best move as a company, and it is good for the consumers, but the major problem with this is that Sony will no longer have any substantial competition. So why is this a problem? It's all because of how most of the world works, capitalism. The way capitalism is intended to work is that it promotes competition so the consumer gets higher quality products, but without competition, then Sony now dominates the high-end console gaming space. There is now less reason to buy an Xbox because of this, and so Sony can potentially monopolize high-end gaming. And yes, you can argue that Sony has already been dominating the space for a while now, but even with Xbox falling behind, they were still a check keeping Sony in balance with what the consumers wanted and fair pricing. So you might be asking yourself, why is this such a big deal? It's because Sony is not a gaming company. They are a general tech company which also has revenue sources in music and in movie production. This means with a monopoly over gaming, they can provide worse products while simultaneously charging higher prices purely because there's no one else to compete with them. And since they have other sources of income, they aren't fully dependent on the consumers to keep the business afloat. And so they can use predatory prices as long as they net some sort of profit. The only other contenders here are Steam and Nintendo, but they both filled their own niches and they don't have much incentive to branch out when they are perfectly satisfied with being in their own bubbles. So with Sony dominating the modern console market and the only other contenders aren't fighting for the same demographic, it could lead to one of many outcomes. Number 1. No change. Sony doesn't change, and this is a good outcome for the industry. Number 2. Control. Sony as a company tries to maximize profits and preys on the consumers due to severe brand loyalty and some people's disinterest or inability to enter the PC space. Number 3. Complacency. Sony acknowledges that they have no competition and starts cutting corners, and so the consumer never gets higher quality products due to no incentive to innovate. This could honestly lead to the worst generation in the entire history of gaming. 9th gen already struggles to find its footing, and it hasn't set itself apart from prior generations. There hasn't really been any must-buy games, and it doesn't help that the Virtual Boy has more exclusives than the 9th gen. Then you have to take into account things like mass layoffs, studio closures, and ever-increasing production costs, and very questionable acquisitions within the industry. And it really makes you think about what direction are we heading in? The only real saving graces I see are Nintendo, Steam, and the rise of indies. But even Nintendo isn't immune, because even they must know how important the next console transition is for them, and it's worrying. Then there's Steam, which doesn't appeal to everyone due to more experience and equipment needed to actually run games. I don't know, the last few years have been great years for players and creativity within the industry, but also some of the worst years the industry has had as a whole. And maybe I'm just being a doomsayer, but with the gaming industry going through such a severe rough patch with acquisitions, mass layoffs, and an ever expanding cost for games, it may be possible that slowly we are going to enter the next video game crash. Let me know your thoughts on all this, and here's hoping that an unchecked Sony still prioritizes the player experience above all, and for a better future overall.